the problem is, there's problems underneath, there's a catalyst underneath the overall picture.
You'll see on the side of the wall here something that was created yesterday, which is effectively a history of the Small Business Centre from its early stages right the way through. And it might be useful for those of you who haven't had a chance to have a look at it afterwards. But those are very much around events, and I think today it might be useful to focus on the outputs and the product from some of those events and some of those activities that are characterised. So to me, the great tradition or the great legacy of the Small Business Centre has been the concepts and the theories and the insights that we explored and we learned both working there and engaging with the Small Business Centre that we've since been able to apply, use, refine and develop in different contexts and environments, not just in the UK, but across the world. So I think the most interesting intellectual question at the moment is what have we learned and what have we generated and produced from the work of the Small Business Centre? And perhaps the second part of the question might be, how is that being used now and how might that be used in the future? So to place it in that context, Allan, if I could ask you really, and this is a sort of a history of the development of the thinking within the Small Business Centre and how it was applied, what would you see as some of those key building blocks that have been used and that underpin the expertise and the knowledge that the Small Business Centre created?
I think the answer to that really lies in the audience. I hope that will come out today, because people sitting around here have a remarkable track record of doing all kinds of different things. But I mean, for me, there was some kind of fundamental and perhaps debatable truths that I don't think we've answered. I think I started with a group of small businesses who funded the centre, and I had to make it pay in 3 years. But for the first 10 years, I did nothing but work with small businesses. Did nothing, didn't write any papers, or I developed some stuff on the emerging MBA program and things like that. But I worked with the small companies, and the first thing I learned was that you must start from where people are and what they think. You must start from the customer and what they think and what they want to do. And I found that is a bit of a problem in business schools in general, though business school was supportive, that they divided the whole world into functions of marketing and finance and strategy and operations and control systems and things like that. And I found from experience that to be alien to what entrepreneurs wanted. What they wanted to do was to start from the problem or the opportunity or their perception of the world and work from that. And I think that the moving thing that I think should be a guide to all business schools actually, but I feel it was very much part of our Small Business Centre heritage and recruiting people who shared that value, was a quote from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, where the quote is something like, "'Tis possible to have the experience, but to miss the meaning." And my feeling always was that if I've got a group of entrepreneurs, there's no way I can ever be like their experience, and never have anything like their experience. But by listening to them, I can try to give more meaning to their experience through reflection. And that was what they might get out of it. They might look at where they were going, look at what other people thought about it. And that is quite important, because it means that you start to focus on things like the important things in an entrepreneur's life to me are know who you learn from, who you work with, and what you get from that. Know how you do things, and know when you do them. And the fact that you don't have strategy separated from action, the two things are mixed up together. And I think that influenced all our courses. It certainly influenced all the work that I was doing initially. But I still see programs for entrepreneurs which are not organised in that way. And that seemed to me to be the fundamental lesson. And the second thing then was to, and some of you will laugh that work with me, never do anything alone. Find partners. You know, so if you're working with an exports Yolanda, you know, you do it with the export club or with the DTI or with the banks or with the chambers of commerce, and you create partnerships for doing things. And by creating partnerships, you learn far more, and they learn far more. So you do it through partnership. You don't do it yourself. And one of the problems with small business is everybody's wanting to put bums on seats for programs and counselling and so, but they're not working in partnership with each other. And without partnership, you can't do what Adam Smith said was the essence of capitalism, successful capitalism. You can't build trust-based relationships. And I think we often think of entrepreneurship as being about individualization. In fact, it's about togetherness and building trust-based relationships. And I think we've forgotten that in the language of business and almost the language of politics as well. I'd go on for hours, but I won't. Do you believe in that? I mean, is there sense in that, or do you object to it? Are there questions? Can I ask that?
Do I wait for a mic, or do I just make a comment?
And if you could introduce yourself as well.
Hello, my name's Keith Gill.
Hi, Keith.
And I was one of the team that developed the Phileas Fogg product range in the 1980s. And I say that as one of the team. One thing that was never recognised was we had an entrepreneurial team. Entrepreneurs are generally seen as individuals or figureheads like Richard Branson. But the concept of an entrepreneurial team is a very powerful one. We had 4 people who had very different characters, and we almost operated like the SAS. The SAS operate in units of 4, and because it's a perfectly nuclear unit.
Yeah.
If there's just one of you, there's far too much to do. If there's 2 of you, you're in danger of being loggerheads. If there's 3 of you, there's the eternal triangle. But if you have building blocks in units of 4, that worked very well. Throughout the 11 years of that project, we never made a vote on anything. There was the quality of the debate, and there was 2 people who might be the protagonists of a subject, and they debated, and the other 2 sat back and listened. But we never made a vote on it. We went with the collective, and off you went. Sometimes you won the debate, sometimes you didn't win the debate. But certainly that was my experience of the strength of working in partnership with teams of people who were professional managers, not necessarily family businesses. So I endorse that totally. Can
I make a comment on that, Andrew? That point sort of fits perfectly, because one of the things I learned by working with small business, and when we built the centre, we built it around small units of 3 or 4 people focused on customers. So we had an education unit, we had a startup unit, we had a growth unit, we had a network unit, was dealing with network relationships. We had a transition economy unit at one time, and a policy unit. So, and all of those were little units of 3 or 4 people who focused on customers and networks, but they overlapped because we trusted each other, you know. But it meant that there was strong ownership of what was happening. People weren't giving lectures. They were actually helping their unit to meet some goals. And the lectures was a mean to an end. You know, so I'm not doing my 16 hours of teaching this week, but I'm helping people do things. And I think that's a very strong thing, to create your teams around small units who are focused on particular aspects of the customer. I don't know whether my colleagues agree with that or not, former colleagues. Or was it a myth?
Well, I think, those of us who were in the small business, we all did work in those units. Yes. And I guess the paradigm was we were all sort of owner managers in our own worlds. Absolutely. As well, and then we could shape and create those worlds as well, and try and, we all had our projects to some extent as well, and it created that space.
And you were financially responsible as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But looking back on it, how much do universities understand that environment? How much do universities appreciate that there are different ways of organising themselves to allow those creative spaces to occur? Because one of the things you could argue over the last 10, 15 years with changes in the university sector, research assessment exercise and so on, actually it's converged to a more standard form of academic unit that makes the sorts of environments at the Small Business Centre much more difficult to, not just to start up, but to sustain as well in that environment.
I think it's a good point, Andrew. I mean, I think that there's just as in society, in education, there's a conflict between rote learning and being an enterprising modes of learning, and the government hasn't sorted that out. In universities, I think there's a conflict between research assessment and publication and relevance and legitimacy in a wider world. I mean, one of the things that we cheated a lot about, and is that we had people in all those units who were not on academic contracts, although they often had PhDs and things like that. Because we had people who were running programs, people who were great teachers, people who were great networkers, people who were great creative people who were good managers. We used people like Richard there, who came from ICI to work with us, who's creative but is a fantastic project manager. And my view is you need all of those people in an organisation to make a good organisation to work with small businesses, and all of them are equal. And our team actually included the porter, Billy, and porter Billy and Frank, and the girls from the kitchen, Marie or Teresa, who are here, and some might be here tonight. They're equal part of the team. The problem I have with the university is this blessed thing of status in general. That academics are up there. As a professor, you can get away with murder in the university, I found, but almost. That's a live quote. But actually,
Keith, you're a reminder that this is live.
Thank God it's alive. It makes me feel good. But you know that basically, I think we've got to build teams of talented, thinking, creative, good management people and that doesn't mean everybody has to publish something. And I think that's a challenge to universities to build comprehensive teams like that in each department almost, because universities are asked to be legitimate in a wide number of different ways now. So it's part of the answer to your question, isn't it?
Yeah. And what about the legacy of some of the? I mean, you talked about working from the entrepreneur and the problems that the entrepreneur or the owner manager had, and then building experiential reflection to work through that and to allow those owner managers to make sense of it. If you think about something like the growth programme, that's been replicated in universities all over the UK, non-university organisations, not just in the UK, all over the world. I mean, it's a bit like Richard Dawkins' meme, where some of the things that have come out of the Small Business Centre have replicated and changed themselves and evolved into their own, ecosystems in different parts of the world. There's an interesting legacy there in terms of that thinking, some of those concepts that's gone through. And one of the things I think is particularly around the growth programme is it challenged some of the more traditional academic views about what small business growth was about at the time, and actually it opened up the opportunities for growth for any owner manager. Whereas actually the academic which was saying it's only 5 or 8% of businesses that create 50% of employment, so the 95 or 92% are irrelevant to any sort of policy debate around growth. I mean, what's your experience and your view about how some of that thinking has permeated through different organisations and different ways of looking at the owner manager and small business development?
That's a good question. I mean, it irritates the pants off me that we tend to regard small businesses and entrepreneurs and self-employed people as objects for growth in employment. If you don't grow your business according to the policy rhetoric, then you're not much use. You forget that most of the jobs come from micro businesses, in fact, in Europe, and from increasingly from white-collar professional services in Europe, where our future students are going to work in health, in leisure, in IT, etc., etc. And we're not preparing students for that, but we're tending to think about only growth businesses. But in a way, what I learned from working with loads of entrepreneurs and mass amounts of learning was that for them, it was a way of life. It's a way of thinking. It's a culture. It's a way of giving meaning to their life. in all kinds of ways. And I think we should stop treating them as objects of employment and growth and as people who want to develop themselves in a certain kind of context, which is becoming increasingly demanding in an uncertain and complex world, where there are lots of opportunities for doing that. And also to treat them as intellectuals. You know, it irritates the pants off me that the government keeps telling us that we have to support small businesses if they somehow were crippled and they needed a crutch to sort of walk around in. And basically, it's interesting because, you know, when you look at entrepreneurs, and there are plenty in this room here, they're true business people. You know, in the sense they've got to manage everything. They've got to, they've got to manage their marketing, their production, their finance, their cash flow, their staff. The true holistic entrepreneurs. One of the mistakes I made right at the beginning, which some people are not going to like me saying this, was I thought that entrepreneurs could learn from professional managers. So I got together right at the beginning a group of entrepreneurs that I knew, that I'd worked with in the original research, together with some heads of subsidiary companies in the region. Yes? And I thought, well, the entrepreneurs are going to learn a lot from these guys. And I realized that most of these subsidiary units were good managers, but they were entrepreneurial eunuchs. You know, they couldn't change the marketing plans of their subsidiary or their company. They couldn't change the production systems of their company. They couldn't change the investment decisions of their company. They were actually managers and administrators, good project managers in many cases, but they didn't have the holistic thing that every entrepreneur has, that has to do everything and so on. And so I felt, well, you know, these managers have got more to learn from the small business than the other way around. But I stopped running programs linking the professional manager with the small business. Perhaps I was wrong to do that. But I realized that the owners were actually having to face a completely different world where they did everything, a different world of relationships that they had to build, trust-based relationships. It was different from running a big subsidiary, and they had, in many ways, they were a dynamic learning organisation. If you don't learn from your customers, your suppliers, your bankers, the inland revenue, your competitors, your family, your staff, all those people, if you don't learn actively all the time, and if you don't educate them, then you cannot be a good entrepreneur. And your life depends on the ability to do that. I don't know whether the entrepreneurs here agree that. That's what I learned from working with them. And you have the power to do that as an individual entrepreneur, which you don't have if you're a manager of subsidiary in many companies. So that's a major thing. I can't remember what your question was now, but
well, so let's take it on a step further then. So, you know, what you're placing at the heart of it is the owner-manager of the entrepreneur and how they learn, what they need to learn. There's a big challenge there for people who then engage with those entrepreneurs to work with them.
Yes.
You know, which is how do you develop the empathy, how do you develop the understanding, how do you develop the skills and the techniques to help those people make sense of their world, because they're so embedded in their worlds that perhaps it's the reflection and looking back on what they're doing outside of that world for a short time that can give them some input. That's a pretty tough task in terms of building that capability in terms of people who work with those owner managers and those entrepreneurs, as well as the organisations that then can sustain those people to do that. What's your views about how well we've done that and what some of the requirements are around that?
I think the two important things from that was, one, everybody who worked at the Small Business Centre had to teach a client group and work with client groups, businesses and others. So we didn't separate out researchers from everybody else. I mean, Lee was a researcher, but actually is heavily engaged with businesses, weren't you, in all kinds of ways. So you don't separate research. I mean, sometimes I think people who are doing research wouldn't know a small business if it hit them when they go and interview an entrepreneur because they've never worked or seen, they don't have the inside knowledge or the tacit experience. But for me, I mean, the fundamental learning that I had was when I first started, I used to write little cases, and often corrupt cases from the Harvard Business School, into, you know, get them down to 3 pages or something for entrepreneurs. And I knew all, and when you look at what Harvard says about case studies, you've got to know all the answers, you've got to be able to do everything, answer any questions that are going to come from the case, and etc., make all these points. This is what they teach you in their videos. And I was sort of waltzing through this thing, you know, this case, answering, you know, everybody had, it was about a printing company, and writing stuff down. I can't write very well, but I used to write stuff down on the chalkboard or whatever it was. And then a little voice said from behind, "I don't want to do this." You know, and the sort of terrible thing went down my back. I thought, oh Christ. You know? So I turned around, and actually it was one of the brightest and breeziest of the things. I said, well, why do you want to do it? And he said, because I'm running a furniture company and I don't really see the relevance of this to my company. And instead of arguing with him, I actually was very brave, and that was mainly changed for me. I just said to him, well, if you're prepared to use your little company to address the kind of issues that we're discussing, we'd be delighted to do this. And he was a very articulate man. I remember, see his face coming his name. And he said, yes, all right. So we built the case round him, you know. And I said, anybody who doesn't see their situation like his, then just come up and say, and we'll develop it from there. But actually, for my confidence, it went like that. Because I became confident not to hide behind PowerPoints or cases or something, but then to learn to start to get people to talk with each other and try to put concept into their practice. And that to me was a fundamental lesson. But to do that, you need to have the confidence to engage with people and listen to them, and then try to make sense of what they're saying and add value to it. And you know, you don't start off with preaching, as most lecturers do. So that was to me I do preach, I know that. But, that to me was fundamental. That question, the fundamental change.
Yeah. So a lot's changed since 2008. And a lot of what the Small Business Centre did was before 2008. I mean, you know, from the mid to late 60s through to sort of late 90s, early 2000s. We read in the press all the time that the economic system's been completely reorganised since the financial meltdown. The future's not going to be the same. Do you think that the learning from the Small Business Centre still holds in that environment? And if it does, is it the same learning and insight, or is that changing with those economic changes, or are those economic changes overhyped and there's some fundamental structures that will continue regardless of macroeconomic turbulence and change?
I think it's made the small business entrepreneurial model more important. You know, I think if you go back to Schumpeter and the academic stuff, then you need entrepreneurial behaviour where there are high levels of uncertainty and complexity in society or in an organisation or in your life. That's when you need to behave entrepreneurially. It's a conditional thing, you know, and everybody's facing, in all kinds of aspects of their life, uncertainty and complexity. I mean, one of the things I used to do with Slavica Singer, Professor Singer in Croatia, was to get the students to go out and to Sančica as well, Professor Sančica, get the students to go out and talk to all kinds of people in the locality, pensioners, young people, policemen, politicians, doctors, about the changing uncertainty and complexity in their lives and how they were handling it, and then bring them back for discussions and drama, which have drama around how you have to behave more enterprisingly in that kind of uncertain and complex environment that everybody has to be, because we've done away with all of this kind of thing. And that's true for universities. I mean, I now engage and designed a leaders program for universities, which is known as Fifth Cohort. I don't direct it anymore. But universities are recognising that they can't just sit back and preach. They have to engage, and they have to learn from engagement, And they've got to listen to the voice of technology, of competition, of different cultures, of migration, of global capitalism, and all kinds of things like that. And they've got to adapt to that uncertain and complex environment, which means they have to change their organisation and redesign their organisation. And I mean, if you look at our banking system, it's totally inadequate for that. I mean, you know, I often say that if you had a banking system like ours, we would have had no industrial revolution. You know, you need a relationship banking system, which interestingly in 1971, when I used to run programs for financing small business banks, the bank manager had massive amounts of power. You know, he could talk to you, and he knew everybody, he'd been there for ages, he'd lend to you at what he thought was an appropriate level, 1% over bank rate or 5%. He made it up himself, right? He didn't have business plans, pages and pages, and cash flow statements, pages and pages. He built it on relationship banking. And the Germans, if you read the literature, have continued to do that, whereas we have gone into a more systematized, you know, the banker lends off one of those these days, and what he can see, he doesn't lend off the relationships because he doesn't know them in the same way. I mean, do you know your bank manager? Personally? Intimately? It's difficult to find one, isn't it? Well, actually, usually when I try to talk to my bank manager, I'm talking to somebody in Mumbai or somewhere like that. That's the nearest I can get to it. Anyway, I'm just preaching there, but basically, I think it's very relevant to society. I think it's very relevant.
Uncertainty and volatility.
And certainly complexity and redesign of organisations of all kinds, not just small businesses, but you know, somebody said to me, what's the biggest entrepreneurial challenge? I would say it's the redesign of the ecosystem, not of entrepreneurs. You know, the redesign of the banks, redesign of the local authorities, redesign of the institutions, the universities, the people that are related. And universities don't relate to small business and entrepreneurship very, very well at all. You know, I've learned in general. And they all recognise the problem, but we don't know how to deal with it.
So are there any drivers for change? Are there any drivers for change?
I think massive drivers. I think the technology, the drivers, but I think the customers are going to be the driver. But people don't like using the word customers about students. We could call them clients, or we could, how would you call them? Partners. Yes, partners. That's a very good point. Partners, yeah. Your partners want change. I mean, they want to be driven back to learning as opposed to coming to university for a job, because the job isn't there anymore as it used to be, but the learning is the big challenge, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was going to say, should we open it up to questions and comments?
Yes, I have a little comment going into a question.
Great.
Yeah?
Can you say who you are,
if you wait for the microphone and then introduce yourself, so. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
No.
You've told us now about these two worlds of small business and big business and your experience in that. And I remember your wonderful definition that small business, it's like a business for the person, and big business, person for the business. Mm. But during your
I can't hear very well because there's not much volume coming out of the...
Robbie, is the mic switched on?
Is the mic on?
It's clear now. Oh yes, it's better. I hope it's better. First of all, sorry for my bad English, and I hope anyway that my question and my comment will be understandable.
Yes.
I'm Ludmila, and I had been studying here for some time,
yes,
a long time ago, and now after my long way in this field of entrepreneurship, support and development from the academic part and from consultancy, training. So I really also have some ideas which I reflect to these points you are developing from. And I have a question to you concerning your past experience in lots of countries abroad of the England, taking into account that we have, like Douglas North, Nobel Award holder, told us in his Violence and Social Orders book, that we have in the world two kind of social orders. The social order with open access, 25 countries in fact. Britain is within them, and USA of course too. And social order with limited access. And when you're talking about networking within the social order with limited access will be very much different, but idea of networking will be helpful for small businesses again and again and again, but different kind of relationships with those Chamber of Commerce or something like that, very different kind of. And I always had observed that there are some really different worlds, like small business and big business, typical big business and typical small business. Typical social order with limited access and with open access, where we have really very much differences. And at the same time, we have such kind of universal laws of development of the rules of the games or rules of the organizational game, intra-organizational games. And especially, I finish my comment, coming to question. Did you find such kind of lots of examples, I guess, but maybe not all of them, that those small businesses which are oriented for growth, they may be very similar in terms of management for not all of big business, but for some part of big businesses, which are also challenging very strong problems, and they are successful to manage them, like from good to great research of the Jim Collins from USA Stanford Management Laboratory, where he found this kind of big businesses which are really like wow. And when I've learned from the result of observation of that companies from good to great stage, from big business, I've just, wow, it's the same like what in good small business oriented for growth and creating jobs and so on, so on. So did you find something like that in your experience of dealing with all of the world differences and these small and big business differences? Sorry for too long.
I think it raises the whole issue of you know, what is the growth business and picking winners, and you know, this whole notion that government or anybody else can pick winners is ridiculous. I mean, there'd be no venture capital if you just pick winners. But what I still think policy can do, and why we invented the growth program, was that if you come with a program that says to an entrepreneur, have you got some ideas for growth? Now, one thing I learned from entrepreneurs, they've got lots of ideas for growth. Many, even people who you wouldn't regard it, they've got lots of ideas. They're either not motivated to do them, or they haven't got the time, or they're too pressed, or haven't got the resource, or what have you. But if you actually, and entrepreneurs are the best people to look for growth opportunities because they're already embedded in the network, you know. So if you really want to work with growth businesses, you find the ones that have the ambition, but also the ones that are prepared to come out and work with you on it. And obviously the people who are looking more actively for an ecosystem of growth, they're the ones that are more likely to come forward. So you don't try and select them, you try to help them, and then they will come forward and work with you. I think trying to select people, if that's what you're saying, out of the system is difficult. Asking people to come forward and work with you to grow the business, I think some will, and we found that they did. I mean, you know, Andrew mentioned there are over 2,000 medium small businesses in Western Australia that have been through our growth program, and hundreds of them in India that have been through the growth program, and the banks now with Dinah, where's Dinah, are going through the growth program in Africa. Is that right, Dinah?
Yeah, in Zambia and Kenya.
Yeah, in Zambia and Kenya, you know, because you need relationship banking businesses to foster. You don't need big corporate. As somebody once said from the banking system in South Africa when I was running a policy workshop with them, said the problem with South Africa is we've got a banking system based on the City of London. You know, that doesn't suit 3/4 of our economy in South Africa and their culture. Trying to get them to do things is hopeless. We need a completely different approach. And you know, the growth program working with small banks in Africa is one way of doing it. But you pick the people with the potential for it. Do you agree with that? I'm very actively involved in development of that kind.
Yeah, there's a relevance. Yeah.
Are you all right to wait for the microphone? Is that all right?
I am all right.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, my name's Allan Gibson. Can you hear me? Alan, what was your question? Is the growth program of relevance to developing countries?
Is the approach to developing business in general one of picking up the people that really want to do things and starting from where they are, getting them out into the open, getting them the confidence to develop, and also that you can develop it into the banking system and other institutions as a model?
I think the approach to development which has evolved is one which has learned a lot from what you said, and I think it is about developing a system, an economic system that gives people opportunities, and that includes changing the banks. The extent to which banks are open to change, of course, is a moot point. And I think the banking system in Kenya, which I know a bit about, isn't that much different from the banking system in the UK, unfortunately. But we try and change it. I have the microphone, however. And while here, although most of my work is in Africa and Asia and those kinds of places, I'm much more interested actually in terms of this event and being able to question you about the Small Business Centre and the North East. I've lived in the North East for 20 odd years. Although, and some of you might not believe this, I'm not actually from the North East originally, but I'm an adopted Geordie. And I always felt, you correct me if I'm wrong, that actually the real driving force, the number one driving force behind the Small Business Centre was about changing the North East. Yeah. It was about changing the culture of the North East. Yes. That culture then beginning to drive fairer and better economic development in the North East. And I wondered what your reflections on now are on that. Part of that change was about changing the university, but not just the university. It was about trying to change the whole region. But on the university, I've always felt the university is I know there are people here from the university. We are in the university, and it's a splendid institution. It's an international, national institution which happens to be in the North East. But I've never felt particularly that it's something, institution which is driving development here. So I'd be interested in your reflections on that, Alan, on the extent to which the Small Business Centre is a legacy in the North East. And if there's not, why not?
I think we failed miserably, quite honestly, because the thing was based originally on some research that I did in 1965, 67. I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit. I came up the North East to look at the problems of the transition of the North East as the coal mining, shipbuilding, the heavy steel was collapsing. In the region, and we were bribing large numbers of companies to come into the region. And I interviewed something like, with a colleague, interviewed about 85 of those subsidiary companies and talked to the companies that were running down. And two things came out of that research. One was the fact that, the point I was making earlier, that the subsidiaries had no power, or very little power to do things, and the situation is still the same. They don't have the power to change and grow independently. And in fact, even then it was worse because they were actually just production units, most of them at that time. And we needed a different kind of culture in the region towards entrepreneurship. If I'd been running the Northern Development Company or one of the agencies regionally, I would have made and it was a recommendation of that report, that we should focus much more on indigenous development, because most of the entrepreneurs here, I would guess, are here for life. You know, they're here for 30 years and doing their stuff, or 30 or 40 years. The average manager of a subsidiary is probably here for about 4 or 5 years before he moves on to better things. You know, and although we have big successes like Nissan, I still feel that we made proposals and argued. I mean, I've made umpteen proposals in the past to create a regional independent owner-managed centre to focus just on owner-managed businesses, you know, and because I believe that anybody who does a vocational qualification should never leave a college of vocational education without knowing how to use that in self-employment necessary. That's a major culture change, but we still haven't got that. We teach business, but that's not the same, you know. And I just think we failed to we engaged with I mean, I made perhaps the biggest failure was I was very close to Heseltine and Trippier, when Trippier was a small firms minister in the 1980s, yes. And it was a time when the enterprise agencies, there were 360 of them in the country at the time, all different, from big ones like Entrust to tiny little ones in locations and so on and so forth, and all funded different ways by big companies, by banks, by revenue and so on and so forth. And I suggested and had discussions with Trippier and Heseltine about making these the main agents for local enterprise development at the time, you know, on a very local basis. Because in my initial research, even in the 1960s, I looked at 8 areas, eight parts of the regional economy, and the problems are radically different in Sunderland, from Teesside, from Newcastle, from Northumberland, from East Durham, from West Durham, and so on. And we needed local initiatives. And if you looked at different sub-regions, then you would see the people that you'd build on would be different in different sub-regions. You know, at that time, the small business club in Teesside was very powerful. It's disintegrated now, but it was something to build on. In other areas, it was weak. In Newcastle, it hardly existed. So the whole idea would be to try and create a centre, but to build regionally. I made proposals that failed. And I suggested to Trippier and Heseltine that they should build their small business development around the sub-regions and these 360 agencies. And the answer was, which is, I remember I'm on live on here, was basically that that would be difficult, because it would be difficult to have and to measure the impact of a highly differentiated system which would result. I mean, so I got the impression that it's better to have a standardised mediocrity that the Treasury can measure and a standardised system than it is to have a highly differentiated based on bottom-up principles. And they wouldn't do it because they couldn't measure in the same way a differentiated system if they were going to support it. And it all had to be accountable to Whitehall anyway. And I think they missed an opportunity then to do it. And again, we failed miserably to change that. So I think, well, we built good networks of everybody in the region, etc. But you know, if you look at policy, it's just been reinventing wheels and reinventing wheels and reinventing wheels for the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, we started off with Enterprise North, which was eight groups of small business people run by Derek Craven and Tim Atherton and set up by Herbert Lobel, who provided all the voluntary support to people, free. You know, it's an absolute myth that entrepreneurs will not help other entrepreneurs because they're too busy. It's just we don't bother to use their energies. And we wanted to keep that Enterprise North in with it. It was the first counselling consultancy service in the country. And the government supported it initially, and then it introduced its own counselling service. And they told me that they wouldn't support Enterprise North anymore because it wasn't professional. You know, you couldn't vouch the quality of groups of entrepreneurs who were advising businesses. But we needed professional standards and counsellor training. Of course, we then did that and made money out of it. But in my view, I sat in all of those meetings in sub-regions and learned a massive amount. Because the entrepreneurs who were advising just had all the connections and knew all the know-how and, you know, knew were the best people to talk with. So we failed, Alan, to build an enterprise north. And we're still failing to use the energies of entrepreneurs to help themselves. When they will give their time to harness that, I don't think we're doing it very, very well. We are doing it, but we're not doing it as well as we might. That would be my view anyway. Is that an answer to your question? Failure. Yeah? Yeah?
Actually, Alan, you're painting a very depressive picture. But frankly, it's true. In 2001, 2002, the previous managing director to Simon, a guy called Stuart Watkins, who's a friend of mine and helped us when we were setting up Durham Valley in 1982, had a bit of a problem. Part of their remit was to go around to the companies that they invested in the region, and do what they called a maintenance report. So in other words, this was going around, meeting people in the businesses, and just understanding where they'd been, what they were doing at the current time, and more importantly, what they were doing in the future. And it was particularly geared up towards jobs. I did 120 of these for Stuart, because I was in between projects at the time. And I analysed them out and segmented them into the areas where there was indigenous decision-making in the area. There were satellites, there were of just production, there were companies that had some autonomy with respect to decision-making. And what I said to Stuart was, I think you're looking at this in the wrong way. And I suggested what he did do was to say, look, we've got limited resources, where we're going to plough them to help and support. And if you had a company like EBAC, who've gone on from strength to strength since then, they are not going to leave. They're based where they're going to be based. If you're looking for jobs, make sure you nurture these, as opposed to giving it to some decision-making that's going on in Norway or what have you.
Yeah.
Now, there's two things that came out of that. One is that didn't go anywhere. It was never followed through. And the second thing was, perhaps for Simon to think it through, is that, you know, the key thing is that question wasn't even being asked. You know, so your support structures for the industry in the northeast, nobody in the public sector was thinking in those sort of terms at that time. And that's half the issue. And what you're saying is that actually, years and years and years ago, you had the right links with entrepreneurial people who were part of the decision-making and support progress. Then it all changed. We mentioned a few times about the whole of the funding situation and the need for the banks to change. Well, also there's need for local investment people to start thinking in a different kind of way. You know, I'm quite encouraged that, well, I'm currently involved in crowdfunding, something I've never done before, never raised money that way before. And it's been quite interesting to see how that is progressing as an alternative to trying to fund micro businesses. And frankly, there's nobody got a top picture view on this except you. So why are we leading you up to, you know, to pastures when you need to be in the middle of something that actually changes the whole programme?
But there are plenty of people here doing all kinds of really interesting, exciting things. Quite honestly, about those situations. The problem is that the central policy is, you know, I mean, if you look at government. I mean, I've worked with governments since the first small firms minister in 1971, Nicholas Ridley. You know, I mean, you get a new junior minister and he wants to do something new, so he changes. You get another 3 years later, you get another junior minister who wants to change, so they get new. There's no intellectual property development in small firms policy making. I mean, the academics write papers, but they don't write, I had a lovely discussion with Andrew about this, they don't write the know-how on their research. They write know-what. They don't tell you how to do things really, because they don't engage with the people who are doing it in many cases. So there's a big gap. You know, if intellectual property is about know-how, then you're not carrying that forward in government, and you're not really carrying know-how in academy through all the publications, or much less than you might be. So there's a great big hole. So we're in policy terms, it's the new fashion. Whoever comes in, then to the next government or the next minister will come. I mean, the first thing senior civil servants used to say for me, we've got a new minister. First thing we do, it's about yes minister. We sit down as civil servants and think, what can we excite him with? You know, let's reinvent something to excite him. So he wants to make his name, or she wants to make her name, so she'll get promotion. And that's the game. It's played in Whitehall. You know, so we don't get continuity of development. And when we have regional development organisations, the problem is that they're all funded from London, like the LEPs are, on project-type basis, where you bid for it. So the control is still down there, you know. It's not up here. So it's a sad situation, but it's almost impossible to develop intellectual property around policy, given the way our systems work. I mean, if we had a dictatorship, it might be better because you'd have somebody who's
That's the Chinese model. So Mark is getting a little bit concerned. I think if we could just squeeze one quick question in.
Yeah, Lee from Sveti. I was just going to pick up on that point. Isn't one of the challenges that we're not very good at retaining institutional memory?
Yes.
So we got a request a couple of weeks ago about nominating someone for a review of self-employment and start-up in disadvantaged areas,
Yes.
which has just been announced. But that was done 12 months ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's that institutional memory is very poor. And I think, well, I've just had an experience with our business where we've got sort of like a double whammy now, where the government are contracting services to the private sector because they think, you know, if we get employer-led services, that will be a far better system. But actually what's happening is the system's being run for the process, not the outcome.
Yes.
And I think there's a bit of a double whammy there in that we're not very good at retaining knowledge, and then what we do is we try to give services to private sector to deliver because they're good at that. But actually then the learner or the end user gets lost in that system.
Okay.
But they're not always part of the network. I mean, one of the funniest anecdotes I had when the government went through the phase of handing regional development stuff to counselling stuff to the small private sector, they gave it in the northeast to somebody from Yorkshire who came up here. In the first meeting I sat on, where everybody was sitting here, and the person said, well, we'd like to get to know each other, so should we introduce each other? Everybody had been working together for the last 15 years, you know, but this guy didn't know, because he was from some private consultancy that got the contract. Should we introduce each other, you know? I mean, it's a nonsense kind of, it's your point.
Yes, my name's Isabella Moore. I'm an entrepreneur for many years, and I'm currently doing a part-time DBA on entrepreneurship for older women. I'm well in that category. So, but I just wanted to say, first of all, that I was on one of your first growth programs at Warwick University. I was in the first cohort, and that was in the 1980s. And what I took from that wasn't so much the sort of how to write the business plans, how to do that. I took away some key sort of things that I've continued to do throughout all my career. One was you can't do everything yourself, which was, you know, that was the first thing. The second thing is do what you like doing and then subcontract everything else quickly, which I did. And we had a problem at the time of tracking projects. We run a company that provides language services to exporters. And we had all these different projects in all these different languages. And part of that part of that programme was we were allocated a consultant who came from the printing business. And it was a big problem for us. How do we keep track of that? I mean, there was no Microsoft project. It was just, how do you see it? And he told us then to put a whiteboard on the wall and track it manually every day. And that process of having the staff round the whiteboard every day. We've just currently taken over a London office, and one of the first things we did was actually to introduce that whiteboard. It was a simple thing, and and we've just used that time and time again. And I just wanted to say it was really, we took a lot of, I took a lot away from that. There was something else you said about managers coming from big businesses. Well, somewhere along the history of the company, I decided that I'd take my own husband into the business. He was in IT from a big corporate company, head of IT. It was the worst decision I ever made. He absolutely...
You are live, just remember.
He'll agree. But he couldn't relate to the small business risk, sort of, your immediate risk, you're there at the coalface, you're as good as the last job we did, and so that didn't last many years. So that's... He's still my husband, though, so... And then it's really, it's a bit of a long intro, but I wanted to ask you a question about partnership. I was about over 10 years ago president of the British Chambers of Commerce, and we were involved very much in trying to build partnerships with other organisations to deliver the sort of support that a lot of our members we felt needed. And one of the problems we came up against was exactly what you said, was the feeling that Chambers of Commerce really couldn't, weren't professional enough to be able to run those type of projects. And obviously there was the debate about taking the Queen's shilling and whether you can really represent your members. And I just really wanted to hear what your views were. Thank you.
I think it's interesting because we once put up to the National Chamber of Commerce the notion of running a growth programme for chambers of commerce, because at that time chambers were run by people who were much more about the systems and rather than actually about treating it as a growth business. And it was about to go when the guy, I can't remember his name now, who was chief executive of the National Chamber of Commerce, went somewhere else, and it collapsed. Because we wanted to treat the chamber as a growth business, and therefore as a relationship management, development, partnership, growth business, where you work with different people in different localities. Because from my student work and from my own experience, if I was to go to Sunderland, the kind of people I choose to redevelop Sunderland enterprisingly might be different than the people down in Teesside, and so on and so forth. The networks are different. But we always seem to want to standardise everything,
Opportunity.
No entrepreneur would behave like that,
Okay, I am going to call it to a close. Can I just say a couple of things, just very briefly. The point about pastures, this is a way to get people back from pastures and to share their experiences of those different pastures. So I think fora like this are important because they aren't a typical type of event that you would have either in a policy context or an academic context. So I think it's incredibly important that everybody's here and that you take the time and make the input over the next day and a half or so to make the contribution to continue these kind of debates. And I think the second thing, of course, is to thank Allan, who as ever has given an insight and a set of understandings that are incredibly helpful and a different way of looking at things to perhaps the standard or the norm that we get. So I think particularly thank you to you, Allan.
It's all right. Thank you.